The moment I walked into the hospital administrator's office and saw the old man from the pharmacy sitting behind the conference table, not in the worn gray cardigan he'd had on that Tuesday morning, but in a perfectly pressed navy suit with a visitor badge that read, Board Chairman, I genuinely thought I had stepped into the wrong room. He looked at me the same way he had at the pharmacy counter. Calm, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world and wasn't particularly interested in using it to make anyone uncomfortable. I almost backed out the door. But my manager, Lena, was right behind me, and she put her hand on my shoulder and said, Go ahead, Cara. He asked for you specifically. I should back up. I work at Mercy Ridge Medical Center, which sounds more impressive than it is. It's a mid-sized community hospital in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where the parking lot floods every spring and the break room microwave has been broken since before I started. I'm a pharmacy technician, have been for 4 years. I fill prescriptions, process insurance, answer questions at the counter, and spend an embarrassing amount of my shift trying to explain to people why their copay went up $17 since last month even though nothing changed except the calendar. It's not glamorous, but I love it. I actually love it, which I know sounds strange, but there's something about being the person who hands someone the thing they need to feel better, even if it's just a little white pill, that makes me feel like the day was worth showing up for. My supervisor at the time was a man named Stuart. I want to be careful about how I describe Stuart because I'm aware that I'm not a neutral party. But I'll try to be fair. Stuart had been with Mercy Ridge for 11 years. He knew the system, knew the insurance codes, knew which pharmaceutical reps brought the best lunches. He was technically competent and organizationally savvy, and he made sure everyone knew both of those things. He managed our department with what I can only describe as aggressive mediocrity. He was never wrong, never uncertain, and never ever willing to let something slide if letting it slide meant someone else got credit for something. I had been on his list since month 2 of working there when I flagged a dosage discrepancy in a patient's chart and brought it to the pharmacist on duty instead of running it through Stuart first. The pharmacist caught a real error. The patient was fine. Stuart pulled me aside afterward and explained, very calmly, that I had bypassed protocol and that if I did it again there would be a formal note in my file. That was the beginning. After that, things were never outright bad. That's the thing about people like Stuart. They're too smart for outright bad. It was more like a slow, consistent drip. The schedule that somehow always gave me the worst shift rotation. The performance review where every strength I had was mentioned once and every minor weakness was given its own paragraph. The way he'd repeat something I'd said in a meeting, word for word, but directed at the pharmacist as though the idea had just occurred to him. I told myself it wasn't personal. Then I told myself it didn't matter. Then I started dreading Sunday nights. The Tuesday it all changed started the way most Tuesdays do. I got to the pharmacy counter at 8:47, which is technically late but within the grace window since the morning rush doesn't usually hit until after 9. I grabbed my badge, tied my hair back and started pulling the overnight pickup queue. At about 9:10, there was a small line at the counter. I worked through it. A woman picking up her husband's blood pressure medication. A guy who needed to know if his antibiotic would interact with the ibuprofen he'd been taking. A teenager who was clearly mortified to be picking up what she was picking up, and I smiled at her like it was the most normal thing in the world, because it was. Then the old man stepped up. He was maybe 75, I'd guess, with white hair that had been combed neatly to the side and a gray cardigan that looked like it had been washed so many times it had forgotten what its original color was. He carried a small paper bag from the corner pharmacy 2 blocks over, the independent one, not a chain, which I noticed only because it was unusual. People don't usually bring bags from other pharmacies to a hospital pharmacy counter. He set the bag down and slid a prescription printout across to me. My doctor called this one in this morning, he said. I was told it was ready. I looked it up. It was ready. I went back and pulled it, came back to the counter, and started ringing it through. That'll be 4218, I said. He nodded, reached into the inside pocket of his cardigan, and pulled out a wallet that was so old the leather had gone soft at the corners. He took out a credit card and handed it to me. I ran it. It came back declined. The people behind him weren't being loud or impatient. but I was aware of them the way you're always aware of a line when something is taking longer than it should. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice low. "It didn't go through. Do you have another card, or—" He was already looking at his wallet. I watched him sort through it with the kind of careful, unhurried patience that told me he wasn't panicking, just thinking. He pulled out a second card. I ran it. Also declined. He looked up at me, not embarrassed, exactly. More like quietly resigned, the way someone looks when something inconvenient has happened and they're deciding how much energy to spend on it. "I think I may have had those cards frozen," he said almost to himself. "I've been traveling. The bank does that sometimes." "Of course," I said. "It happens." He reached back into his wallet. I could see he was counting cash. He had, by my count, about $28. The prescription was $42. I don't know exactly what made me do what I did next. I've thought about it a lot since then, and I still can't give you a clean explanation. It wasn't a calculated decision. It wasn't even really a decision. It was more like my hand just went to my own pocket. I had $40 in cash on me. I'd taken it out of the ATM the day before for a grocery run I never got around to. I took out 2 20s and slid them under the partition before I'd finished the thought. "Go ahead and put your cash back," I said. "I've got it." He looked at the money, then at me. "Young lady, please," I said, and I smiled because I meant it. "It's not a big deal. I hope the rest of your day is better." He held my gaze for a moment. He had the kind of eyes that look like they've seen a very large number of things and have come to terms with most of them. "What's your name?" he asked. I hesitated, only because I wasn't sure if this was going to turn into a longer conversation than I had time for. "Cara," I said. He nodded slowly. "Thank you, Cara." He picked up the prescription bag, tucked it under his arm, and walked toward the elevator. I watched him go for 1 second, then turned to the next person in line. I didn't think about it again for 11 days. The 11 days in between were not good days. Stuart had been assigned to lead a departmental efficiency review, which, roughly translated, meant he had been given license to document everything that was wrong with how the rest of us were doing our jobs. He walked the floor with a tablet and made notes. He sat in on the morning count. He pulled the prescription error logs from the past 6 months and circled things in red with a stylus, and he did it at the main workstation where everyone could see him doing it. On day 4, he called me into his office. "I've been looking at your turnaround times on complex insurance cases," he said. I sat down. "Okay, they're slower than the department average. Complex cases are slower by definition," I said. "That's what makes them complex." He smiled the way people smile when they want you to know they didn't find something funny. "The point is efficiency, Cara. We have a throughput goal." I understand the throughput goal. I also understand that rushing a complex insurance dispute increases the error rate. That's not really your call to make. I looked at him. I'm the one making the call, so I think it is. He wrote something on his tablet. That was the conversation. He didn't threaten anything specific. He didn't have to. The writing something down was the whole message. The next week, he changed my schedule without notice, moving me to a shift that conflicted with the online class I'd been taking for my certification. When I brought it up, he said scheduling decisions were made at the department level and weren't subject to individual preferences. I asked if I could request a swap. He said he'd look into it. He did not look into it. On Thursday of that week, he pulled me aside to tell me that a patient had complained about wait times and that my station had been flagged in the log. I wasn't the only person working the counter, I said. "You were the primary," he said. I went home that night and sat on my couch for a long time without turning on any lights. I wasn't angry exactly. I was tired in a way that's different from needing sleep. The kind of tired that comes from trying very hard for a long time in a direction that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. I thought about quitting. I'd thought about it before, in a vague background sort of way. But that night, it felt more specific. More possible. I didn't sleep well. On the 11th day, Lena knocked on the door of the dispensing room where I was working through a backlog and said, "Stuart wants you in the conference room." Now. I pulled off my gloves and followed her down the hall. The conference room at Mercy Ridge is a glass-walled box near the administrative wing. I could see through the window as we walked toward it. Stuart was there, standing near the window with his arms crossed, and across the table from the empty chair that was apparently meant for me, there was an older man in a navy suit. It took me a few seconds. The cardigan was gone. The worn wallet was presumably somewhere other than his breast pocket. His hair was combed the same way. His eyes were the same. But he was sitting at the head of the conference table, and there was a name placard in front of him that read Arthur Bellamy, Chairman, Mercy Ridge Health Foundation. I stopped walking. Lena, behind me, said quietly, "Go ahead, Cara. He asked for you specifically." I walked in. I didn't know what else to do. Stuart looked at me the way he always looked at me in front of other people, like I was an item on a list he was working through. "Cara," he said. "Mr. Bellamy is here for a scheduled meeting with department leads." He had a few questions about frontline operations. Mr. Bellamy looked at me and said nothing for a moment. Then, "I remember you." Stuart's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You've met, briefly," Mr. Bellamy said. He gestured toward the empty chair. "Please sit down." I sat. What happened over the next 40 minutes is something I've gone over many times in my mind, and I still find parts of it hard to fully account for. Mr. Bellamy asked me questions. Real questions. Not the kind that are actually statements in disguise, but genuine inquiries about how the department ran, what worked, what didn't, where patients most often ran into friction. He listened to the answers the way people listen when they're actually going to use what they hear. At one point, he asked me about the efficiency review. I glanced at Stuart. Mr. Bellamy said, "I'm asking you, not him." So I told him. Not with anger. I was too tired for anger by that point. But honestly, I told him about the throughput targets and the trade-offs. I told him about the schedule change and the certification class. I told him about the patient complaint and how it had been attributed. I did not tell him about the money at the pharmacy counter. It hadn't crossed my mind that he'd connect those things. When I was done, there was a pause. Mr. Pause. Bellamy looked at Stuart for a long moment. Stuart looked back at him with the careful expression of someone who has just realized they misread the room but can't yet figure out by how much. "Stuart," Mr. Bellamy said, "I think we should have a separate conversation." That was all he said about it. But his tone was the kind of tone that doesn't need elaboration. He turned back to me. "Cara, thank you for your time. And," he paused, "for your kindness. 3 weeks ago and today, both. For your kindness. 3 weeks ago and today, both." I didn't know what to say. "You didn't have to do this," I finally said, and I meant it. "No," he agreed. "But I wanted to understand what was actually happening in this department. I find that people who work quietly and well are often the best sources of that kind of information." He glanced briefly at Stuart, and occasionally the least likely to be listened to. He stood up. I stood up. He extended his hand and I shook it. "The certification class," he said. "Which one?" I told him. He nodded. "Finish it," he said. "That's a good investment." I found out from Lena 2 weeks later that Stuart had been moved to a different role. She called it a lateral move with adjusted responsibilities, which is HR language for something that is not quite a firing, but is also not a promotion. He wasn't gone, but he wasn't my supervisor anymore. The new interim supervisor was a woman named Dr. Patel, who had previously been over in the clinical side and who, on her first day, asked everyone in the department to introduce themselves and tell her one thing they wished worked differently. She wrote everything down. She followed up on 3 of the things within the first week. My schedule was corrected. I finished my certification class. I heard from a colleague in administration that Mr. Bellamy had included a note in his departmental review about frontline pharmacy staff, specifically about the gap between efficiency metrics and actual patient care quality. I don't know exactly what it said. But a few months later, our department's performance evaluation criteria were revised. The throughput targets were restructured to account for case complexity. The $40 I spent at the pharmacy counter that Tuesday morning was not something I'd thought of as an investment. It wasn't something I'd thought of as anything, really. It was just $40, and the man had needed it, and I had it. I've thought a lot about what I would say if someone asked me what the lesson was. I don't think the lesson is that you should help people because they might turn out to be powerful. That gets the whole thing exactly backwards. Arthur Bellamy didn't have 4 stars on his shoulders or a name placard in front of him when I handed him those 220s. He was just an older man with a frozen bank card and a quiet dignity that made me want to make things a little easier for him. The fact that he was chairman of the hospital foundation is genuinely beside the point. But I do think there's something true about the idea that people who carry real authority, not the kind that comes from making sure everyone below them knows their place, but the actual earned kind, are often not who you'd expect. They tend to move through the world without announcing themselves. They're curious, they ask real questions, they notice things. The people who make the most noise about being important are often covering for something. The people who are actually important are usually too busy paying attention to bother. I think about Stuart sometimes. I don't think he was a bad person, exactly. I think he was a frightened one, and that all that careful positioning and strategic note-taking was his way of managing a fear that the thing he built around himself wasn't as solid as he needed it to be. That's a sad way to spend 11 years. I hope wherever he landed, he found something that felt more like solid ground. I think about the old man, Mr. Bellamy, less than you'd expect. Not because I'm ungrateful, but because what I remember most isn't the conference room or the name placard. What I remember is the pharmacy counter, the worn cardigan, the way he counted his cash very carefully and didn't seem embarrassed about it, just present. The way he said my name before he left. Thank you, Cara. There was something complete in that. Something that didn't need a conference room to finish it. I think about that sometimes. When the line is long and someone's insurance is doing something inexplicable, and the person on the other side of the counter looks tired in that specific way people look when they've had to fight for something that should have been simple. I try to make it a little simpler when I can, not because of what happened with Mr. Bellamy, just because it costs very little and it matters more than the other person can usually tell you. And sometimes that's enough. I've gone back and forth on whether to call what happened to me luck. It's easier that way. It wraps things up cleanly, right place, right time, good things happen to good people, end of story. But I don't actually think that's what it was, and the more I sit with it, the more I think luck is just what we call it when we can't trace the chain of events back far enough to see what actually started things moving. What I did at that pharmacy counter took about 30 seconds. I handed over $40 to a man I didn't know, said something I meant, and turned back to the line. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't write it down. By the time I got home that night, I'd honestly stopped thinking about it. That's the part that matters, I think. Not the act itself, but the fact that there was nothing attached to it. No expectation. No expectation. No calculation. It wasn't generosity as strategy. It was just a person in front of me who needed something and I had it, and so I gave it. I think that quality, the willingness to act without needing a return, is actually a form of intelligence, even if it doesn't look like one. It requires a certain clarity about what actually matters. Stuart had a different kind of intelligence. He was sharp, organized, technically skilled, but so much of that intelligence was aimed inward, at protecting something, at making sure the credit landed right and the blame landed elsewhere. That's exhausting in a way that eventually shows. It shows in how people move around you, in the energy of a room when you walk in what happens when someone with real authority sits down and starts asking real questions. Arthur Bellamy had been watching rooms like that for decades. He knew the difference between someone who was performing competence and someone who was actually doing the work. He didn't need a performance review to tell him. He just needed 11 days and one honest conversation. What I keep thinking about is the sequence. I didn't help him because I knew he was important. I didn't know. I couldn't have known. I helped him because it was the right call in that moment, for no other reason. And because of that, because there was nothing self-serving in it, he trusted what he saw in me. He trusted it enough to walk into that conference room and ask questions that needed asking. That's the chain, not luck. not coincidence. A series of choices, made one at a time, each one either building something or eroding it. Stuart's choices eroded something. Mine, apparently, built something. Quietly. Without my knowing, the way most real things get built. I'm not saying this to make myself sound noble. I was also just a person trying to get through the week. But I do think there's something worth holding on to in the idea that character isn't built in the moments when someone is watching. It's built in the counter moments. The pharmacy counter. The ordinary Tuesday. The $40 you hand over without thinking about it to someone you'll probably never see again. Except sometimes you do see them again. And they're sitting at the head of the table. And what you did when no one was watching turns out to be the most important thing about you. I think about that on the hard days. It helps.